In the final crushing months of World War II, two Allied commanders stood at opposite ends of a moral spectrum that would define their legacies forever. One man, revered as the architect of victory, quietly turned his back on those who had fought beside him. The other, lesser known to history, honored every warrior who shed blood under his command and unleashed calculated fury against an enemy that represented pure evil. This is the story of choices that echo through generations, of promises broken and kept, and of a reckoning on the battlefield that would leave the Hitler Youth's most fanatical division shattered beyond recognition. The year was 1945. Europe lay in ruins. Millions had died. And in the corridors of power where medals were distributed and honors bestowed, indigenous veterans who had crossed oceans to fight fascism found themselves invisible once again. Meanwhile, on blood-soaked ground in northwest Europe, a Canadian general named Harry Crerar was about to demonstrate that honor and vengeance could walk hand in hand. What follows is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It's far more complicated and far more human than that. It's about systems of oppression that persisted even as men died for freedom. It's about a fighting force so indoctrinated that teenage boys charged machine guns with fanatical devotion. And it's about decisions made in the chaos of war that reveal the true character of those who make them. The numbers tell part of the story. Over 12,000 Indigenous people from Canada volunteered to fight in World War II. From the United States, another 44,000 Native Americans enlisted. They came from reservations where poverty was grinding and opportunities were non-existent. They came despite centuries of broken treaties. They came despite being denied citizenship in their own ancestral lands. They came because when evil threatens the world, some men simply cannot stand aside. These warriors brought something unique to the modern battlefield. Generations of hunting and tracking skills translated into reconnaissance abilities that astonished their commanders. Their languages became unbreakable codes. Navajo code talkers in the Pacific transmitted messages that Japanese cryptographers never deciphered. Cree and Ojibwe soldiers in Europe provided communication security that baffled German intelligence. They were snipers, scouts, paratroopers, and frontline infantry. They bled the same red blood as everyone else when bullets tore through flesh. But when victory came and the parades began, something unconscionable happened. The massive celebration planning for Allied triumph included detailed protocols for recognizing the contributions of various forces and nations. Committees met. Lists were drawn up. Speeches were drafted. And in those lists, Indigenous veterans were systematically excluded from official recognition events. Dwight Eisenhower presided over this machinery of forgetfulness. Not through malice, perhaps, but through the same institutional blindness that had characterized American treatment of Native peoples for generations. The Supreme Commander who orchestrated D-Day, who coordinated millions of troops across multiple fronts, somehow could not see fit to ensure that Indigenous warriors received equal honor. When Native American soldiers stood in formation waiting to be acknowledged, that acknowledgement never came. When Indigenous Canadian troops expected to march in victory celebrations alongside their comrades, they were quietly shuffled aside. The bureaucratic language was always carefully neutral. Protocols, procedures, space limitations. But the message was clear as crystal to those who had fought and survived. Your sacrifice was noted. Your blood was acceptable. But your presence at the victor's table is not required. Go back to your reservations. Return to your poverty. The photographs of triumph will not include you. This was not an oversight. Military bureaucracies do not accidentally forget entire populations of servicemen. This was systemic exclusion, the continuation of colonial attitudes even in the moment when those colonial powers were supposedly fighting for freedom and equality. The bitter irony was lost on no one who lived it. Indigenous warriors had defeated fascism abroad only to return home to a different kind of oppression. Contrast this with the actions of General Harry Crerar, commander of the 1st Canadian Army. While his American and British counterparts were organizing segregated celebrations and color-coded honor systems, Crerar was doing something radical. He was treating Indigenous soldiers exactly as he treated every other soldier under his command. Not as political props. Not as exotic curiosities. But as warriors who had earned respect through blood and courage. Crerar's army included significant numbers of Indigenous troops. Cree warriors from the Northern Territories. Mohawk soldiers from Quebec. Ojibwe fighters from Ontario. They served in regular units, not segregated formations. They held ranks from private to officer. And when Crerar addressed his troops or distributed commendations or planned recognition ceremonies, Indigenous soldiers were present and honored as equals. This was not performative allyship. This was not a publicity strategy. Crerar's recognition of indigenous contributions came naturally from his understanding of what made effective military leadership. He had observed these soldiers in combat. He had seen Cree scouts slip through enemy lines and return with intelligence that saved hundreds of lives. He had watched indigenous snipers eliminate German officers at ranges that seemed impossible. He had witnessed the unbreakable calm of native soldiers under artillery bombardment that turned other men into shaking wrecks. Crerar understood something fundamental that others missed. War reveals character. Combat strips away pretense. On the battlefield, what matters is courage, competence, and commitment. Indigenous soldiers possessed all three in abundance. To exclude them from recognition after victory was not just immoral. It was factually wrong. It was a lie about history being told in real time. But Crerar's story is not just about honor and recognition. It's also about calculated violence against an enemy that deserved no mercy. And that enemy was the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth Division, perhaps the most fanatical fighting force ever fielded by Nazi Germany. Understanding the 12th SS requires understanding the depth of Nazi indoctrination. These were not regular soldiers conscripted from ordinary German society. These were teenagers who had spent their entire adolescence immersed in Hitler Youth propaganda. They had learned to march before they learned to think critically. They had practiced shooting before they understood ethics. They believed with absolute conviction that they were the master race destined to rule the world, and that dying for Hitler was the highest honor imaginable. The division was formed in 1943 from 17 and 18-year-old volunteers, boys too young for standard Wehrmacht conscription but old enough to be molded into weapons. Their training was brutal and comprehensive. They learned tactical doctrine from experienced Eastern Front veterans. They absorbed Nazi racial ideology in daily indoctrination sessions. They were taught that Slavs were subhuman, Jews were vermin, and Western democracies were decadent and weak. When the 12th SS arrived in Normandy in June 1944 to counter the Allied invasion, they brought fanaticism that shocked even hardened Allied veterans. These teenage soldiers did not retreat. They did not surrender. They fought with suicidal aggression, launching counterattacks that defied military logic, holding positions long after any rational commander would have withdrawn. But fanaticism and war crimes often walked together. The 12th SS became infamous for murdering prisoners of war. Canadian soldiers captured during the initial fighting in Normandy were shot in cold blood. The Ardennes Abbey massacre saw dozens of Canadian prisoners executed by SS troops who considered Geneva Convention protections irrelevant. To the Hitler Youth, enemy soldiers were not fellow humans entitled to mercy. They were obstacles to be eliminated by any means necessary. These atrocities were not isolated incidents by rogue soldiers. They were manifestations of the ideology the entire division embraced. The 12th SS leadership encouraged aggression without limits. Their soldiers were taught that mercy was weakness, that compassion was racial treason, that total war meant exactly that. 15-year-old boys who might have spent their youth playing sports and chasing girls instead spent it learning how to kill without hesitation or remorse. When news of the prisoner massacres reached Allied command, reactions varied. Some commanders filed reports and waited for justice through proper channels. Others muttered about payback but continued conventional operations. Harry Crerar took a different approach. He decided the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend needed to be destroyed so completely that its name would become a warning to history. This was not hot-blooded revenge. Crerar was not a man prone to emotional decisions. This was cold calculation. He recognized that the 12th SS represented something beyond normal military opposition. They were ideological warriors who would never surrender, never stop fighting, never show mercy. The only way to neutralize such an enemy was complete annihilation. Not just defeating them tactically but crushing them so thoroughly that their fighting effectiveness ceased to exist. The opportunity came during Operation Tractable in August 1944, part of the larger battle to close the Falaise pocket and trap retreating German forces. The 12th SS was positioned as part of the German defensive line, tasked with keeping escape routes open for other Wehrmacht units. They were dug in, determined, and dangerous. They had demonstrated repeatedly that they would fight to the death. Crerar assembled overwhelming force. Artillery concentrations that would turn the earth itself into a weapon. Armor formations to exploit any breakthrough. Infantry to root out survivors from their positions. And crucially, tactical air support to rain destruction from the skies. He was not interested in a fair fight. He was interested in extermination. The Canadian units chosen for the assault included many of the same soldiers who had found murdered comrades in Normandy. They knew what the 12th SS had done. They understood this was not ordinary combat. This was righteous destruction of an enemy that had forfeited any claim to honorable treatment. Among those soldiers were indigenous warriors who would prove once again that when civilization needed defenders, they answered the call. The bombardment began before dawn. Artillery shells screamed overhead in a continuous thunder that shook the ground for miles. High explosive rounds obliterated bunkers. White phosphorus shells created infernos that consumed everything. Smoke rounds blinded the defenders. 4 hours, the 12th SS positions received more explosives than most units experienced in months of combat. The noise alone was enough to drive men mad. When the infantry advanced, they moved behind a creeping barrage, a wall of exploding shells that moved forward at a walking pace. Any German soldier who survived the initial bombardment and tried to man his weapon was immediately suppressed by the next wave of artillery. The 12th SS fighters were brave to the point of insanity, but bravery cannot stop high explosive shells that land directly in your trench. The Hitler Youth soldiers tried to mount their characteristic counterattacks. Small groups of survivors would gather around a functioning tank or heavy weapon and charge the Canadian lines with the fanaticism that had made them famous. They were cut down by coordinated fire from multiple weapons systems. Machine guns, mortars, tank cannons, rockets. The Canadians had trained for this. They knew the 12th SS tactics. They were ready. Indigenous soldiers played crucial roles throughout the assault. Cree scouts identified hidden positions that might have caused heavy casualties. Ojibwe snipers eliminated German officers trying to rally their men. Mohawk soldiers led infantry assaults with the same warrior courage their ancestors had shown centuries earlier. They fought not for conquest or glory, but because evil had to be stopped and they were capable of stopping it. The battle raged for days. The 12th SS refused to break even as their casualties mounted beyond sustainable levels. Teenage soldiers with barely any facial hair held positions until they were killed or physically overrun. Officers led suicidal charges rather than order retreats. The ideological indoctrination was so complete that surrender seemed literally impossible to most of them. But ideology cannot withstand industrial-scale destruction indefinitely. Slowly, inexorably, the Canadian assault ground forward. Positions that the 12th SS had sworn to hold forever were captured. Supply lines were severed. Medical support vanished. Ammunition ran low. The fanaticism remained, but the capability to effectively fight deteriorated with each passing hour. By the time the Falaise pocket finally closed, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the 20,000 soldiers who had constituted the division at full strength, fewer than 300 exhausted survivors escaped the pocket. Their tanks were destroyed. Their artillery was captured or abandoned. Their infantry was dead, wounded, or prisoner. The division that had terrorized Normandy with its fanaticism and war crimes had been obliterated. Crerar's after-action reports were characteristically understated. Objectives achieved. Enemy neutralized. Casualties within acceptable parameters. But everyone who participated understood what had really happened. The 12th SS had been singled out for destruction, and that destruction had been thorough and merciless. Justice, of a sort, had been delivered on the battlefield. The surviving members of the 12th SS were eventually reconstituted into a shadow of their former strength and sent to fight on the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Red Army finished what the Canadians had started. By the war's end, the Hitler Youth Division had been destroyed twice over. The teenagers who had marched so proudly into battle with absolute faith in their Führer and their cause were dead in fields across Europe. The ideology that had made them so dangerous had also ensured their annihilation. But while the 12th SS was being ground into the mud of France, the indigenous soldiers who helped defeat them were being erased from the story back home. Victory parades were organized. Monuments were planned. Official histories were drafted. And systematically, the contributions of native warriors were minimized or omitted entirely. Eisenhower presided over ceremonies where every Allied nation was recognized except the indigenous peoples who had fought under multiple flags. British troops marched. Free French forces were celebrated. Belgian, Dutch, Norwegian, and Polish units received honors. But when indigenous veterans waited for their moment of recognition, that moment never came. The photographers looked past them. The speechwriters forgot them. The official record moved on. The cruelty of this exclusion cannot be overstated. These men had volunteered to defend nations that had spent centuries trying to destroy their cultures. They had fought for countries that denied them basic rights. They had risked everything for the abstract principle of freedom while being denied freedom in their own lands. And when victory came, they were told through action if not words that their sacrifice, while useful, was not the kind that merited public acknowledgement. Native American soldiers returned to reservations where they could not vote in state elections. Canadian Indigenous veterans went back to communities where they faced residential schools that aimed to erase their culture. The nations they had defended showed gratitude through medals and benefits for white soldiers, while Indigenous warriors received fractions of what they had earned. The GI Bill that transformed American society and created the middle class was systematically denied to many Native American veterans through bureaucratic obstacles and outright racism. Harry Crerar took a different path. When he returned to Canada after the war, he continued to recognize Indigenous contributions in his public statements and private correspondence. When Indigenous veterans faced discrimination in accessing benefits, he used his influence to fight for them. He understood that honor was not just something you displayed during war. It was a principle you lived by in peace. The contrast between these two generals tells us something profound about leadership and character. Eisenhower, for all his strategic brilliance and organizational genius, was still a product of an American system that considered Indigenous peoples as lesser. He could not see past institutional prejudices even in his moment of greatest triumph. His exclusion of Native veterans was not personal malice but systemic blindness, which in some ways makes it worse. It was the banality of discrimination, so normalized that it required no conscious decision. Crerar, commanding a smaller army from a smaller nation, recognized that true leadership meant seeing people as individuals rather than categories. He judged soldiers by their actions in combat, not by their race or background. This seems like a basic principle of military meritocracy, but in practice it was revolutionary. By simply treating Indigenous soldiers as equals, Crerar was defying centuries of colonial thinking. The destruction of the 12th SS adds another dimension to this comparison. War creates situations where violence becomes necessary, where mercy to a dangerous enemy enables more killing later. The Hitler Youth Division had demonstrated through its actions that it would never stop fighting, never show mercy, never respect the laws of war. Crerar's decision to pursue its complete destruction was not sadism. It was strategic necessity combined with justified retribution for war crimes. There is a harsh lesson here about the difference between necessary violence and unnecessary cruelty. The 12th SS showed unnecessary cruelty when they executed prisoners who had surrendered. They violated fundamental rules of warfare because their ideology taught them that such rules were weakness. The Canadian assault that destroyed them was harsh but legitimate. It targeted enemy soldiers in combat. It used overwhelming force not out of hatred but out of determination to end the threat completely. Indigenous soldiers who participated in that destruction understood the distinction. Their warrior traditions included concepts of honorable combat and necessary force. They knew the difference between killing in battle and murder. They recognized that the 12th SS had crossed lines that required response. Their participation in the assault was not revenge in a petty sense. It was justice delivered by warriors who understood what justice sometimes requires. The years after 1945 slowly revealed the full extent of what had been won and what had been lost. The Holocaust was documented. The scale of Nazi atrocities became undeniable. The Allied cause was vindicated as unquestionably righteous. But at the same time, the injustices within the Allied nations became harder to ignore. How could America claim moral superiority over Nazi racial laws when Jim Crow segregation continued? How could Canada celebrate defeating fascism while forcing Indigenous children into residential schools? Indigenous veterans became living contradictions to national mythologies. They had proven their worth on the most brutal battlefields in history. They had shown courage, skill, and dedication equal to any soldiers from any background. They had earned respect through blood. And yet the systems they returned to continued treating them as second-class citizens at best, as problems to be solved at worst. Some found ways to use their veteran status to fight for change. They became activists for Indigenous rights, using their military credentials to demand the respect they had earned. They organized veterans groups that crossed tribal boundaries. They lobbied for benefits and recognition. Slowly, painfully they made progress. But it was progress measured in decades, and many did not live to see the recognition they deserved. Others retreated into their communities and tried to rebuild lives interrupted by war. They carried memories of combat that they rarely discussed. They dealt with physical wounds and psychological trauma in an era when PTSD was not recognized or treated. They watched as the nations they had defended continued policies designed to erase their cultures. The betrayal they felt was profound and permanent. Harry Crerar retired from military service and watched as the world he had helped save struggled with peace. He saw the Cold War emerge from World War II's ashes. He witnessed the Korean conflict draw some of the same Indigenous soldiers back into combat. He observed the slow evolution of Canadian policy toward Indigenous peoples, the grudging recognition that came far too late for too many. He did not live to see full acknowledgement of Indigenous military contributions, but he never stopped advocating for it. Eisenhower ascended to the presidency and then to elder statesman status. He was revered as the general who won the war in Europe, the leader who held the fractious Allies together, the steady hand that guided millions of soldiers to victory. His reputation as a great man of history was secure. But the exclusion of Indigenous veterans from his moment of triumph remained a permanent stain on his legacy, one that historians would eventually examine and condemn. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend became a symbol of everything wrong with Nazi Germany. The indoctrination of children into fanatical warriors. The war crimes justified by racial ideology. The waste of young lives in service of evil. Historians studied the division as a case study in how societies can corrupt their youth. The teenage soldiers who died in French fields became cautionary tales about the dangers of totalitarian education. But there are deeper lessons in this story that go beyond the obvious. The exclusion of Indigenous veterans reveals how discrimination operates even in moments of supposed unity. World War II is often portrayed as the good war, when nations came together to defeat evil. But that unity had limits. It did not extend to challenging fundamental racial hierarchies within Allied nations. Victory over fascism abroad did not require confronting racism at home. The destruction of the 12th SS demonstrates that moral clarity in war does not mean all violence is equal. There are meaningful distinctions between legitimate combat and atrocity, between necessary force and sadistic cruelty. The Canadian assault that annihilated the Hitler Youth Division was brutal but justified. The 12th SS execution of prisoners was neither. Recognizing this difference is crucial for understanding ethics in warfare. The contrast between Eisenhower and Crerar shows that leadership is revealed not just through grand strategy but through small decisions about recognition and respect. Crerar did not perform dramatic gestures. He simply treated Indigenous soldiers with the dignity they had earned. That basic decency made him more honorable than generals who commanded larger forces but could not see past racial prejudice. Indigenous warriors who fought in World War II understood something profound about duty and honor. They served despite betrayal. They fought for nations that had oppressed them. They demonstrated loyalty to principles of freedom even when those principles were denied to them. This is a deeper form of patriotism than simple flag waving. It is commitment to ideals even when institutions fail those ideals. The story is incomplete because justice remains incomplete. Indigenous veterans eventually received some recognition, but often posthumously and always belatedly. Monuments were built decades after they should have been. Apologies came from officials who had not been born when the exclusion occurred. The symbolic gestures were meaningful but could not restore what had been stolen. The moment of recognition when it would have mattered most, the acknowledgement from peers and commanders while memories were fresh and veterans were young. Today, military historians increasingly recognize Indigenous contributions to Allied victory. Academic studies document the code talkers, the scouts, the snipers, the frontline infantry. Popular culture slowly includes Indigenous warriors in World War II narratives. Progress happens. But it happens slowly, and every year fewer Indigenous veterans survive to see it. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend exists now only in history books and the memories of those who fought against it. Its destruction stands as proof that fanaticism cannot overcome determined opposition backed by superior force. The teenage soldiers who believed so completely in Hitler's lies are dust. The ideology that made them dangerous is discredited. The division's legacy is a warning. Harry Crerar's name is less famous than Eisenhower's, less recognized than Montgomery's or Patton's. But among those who study leadership and ethics in warfare, his reputation grows. He proved that honor and effectiveness are not contradictory. He showed that respecting all soldiers under your command makes you a better commander. He demonstrated that principles matter even in the chaos of total war. Dwight Eisenhower's exclusion of Indigenous veterans from official recognition remains the least discussed aspect of his legacy. It receives footnotes in biographies that focus on his strategic decisions and political career. But for Indigenous communities, it is not a footnote. It is the central fact of how they were treated by a nation they defended. It is the betrayal that cannot be forgotten. The Indigenous warriors who crossed oceans to fight fascism did so for complex reasons. Some sought adventure or escape from reservation poverty. Some believed in the Allied cause. Some felt duty to their communities. But all of them demonstrated through their actions that courage and honor are not defined by race or background. They proved themselves on battlefields where failure meant death. They earned respect the hardest way possible. When they returned home and faced systematic exclusion, they learned that earning respect and receiving respect are different things. They learned that some prejudices survive even total war. They learned that victory over fascism abroad did not guarantee justice at home. These lessons were bitter, but they did not break the warriors who learned them. The story of Eisenhower's exclusion and Crerar's honor is ultimately about choices. Eisenhower chose to accept the discriminatory systems around him rather than challenge them in his moment of maximum influence. Crerar chose to see past those systems and treat people as individuals. The 12th SS chose fanaticism and war crimes. Indigenous warriors chose duty despite betrayal. All of these choices had consequences that echo through decades. War reveals character because it creates situations where choices matter absolutely. In combat, you cannot hide behind rhetoric or good intentions. Your decisions result in immediate consequences. People live or die based on what you choose to do. This clarity makes war both terrible and, in a strange way, honest. It shows who people really are. Eisenhower was revealed as a brilliant organizer who could not transcend the prejudices of his era. Crerar was revealed as a leader who understood that honor means treating all people with dignity. The 12th SS was revealed as a fanatical force that would commit any atrocity in service of evil ideology. Indigenous warriors were revealed as soldiers equal to any in the world, capable of defeating the most dangerous enemies humanity has produced. The battlefield where the 12th SS was destroyed is quiet now. The shell craters have been filled. The burned tanks have been removed. Fields that were turned to moonscapes by artillery are farmland again. But the ground remembers. Metal detectors still find bullets and shrapnel. Farmers still occasionally unearth human remains. The earth keeps the secrets of what happened there. The indigenous veterans who participated in that destruction are nearly all gone now. A few survive in their late 90s or beyond, living repositories of memories that will soon exist only in archives and oral histories. They saw the 12th SS broken and scattered. They witnessed the cost of fanaticism. They helped deliver justice for murdered comrades. And then they came home to find themselves written out of the story. This final betrayal, this exclusion from recognition at the moment of triumph, was in some ways the cruelest wound. Physical injuries heal or at least become familiar. Traumatic memories fade or can be managed. But the knowledge that your nation will accept your sacrifice while denying your dignity is a wound that never closes. It is a betrayal that remains fresh across generations. Yet indigenous communities persisted. They maintained warrior traditions while adapting to modern realities. They remembered their veterans even when official histories forgot them. They passed down stories of courage and sacrifice. They taught their children that duty and honor are not dependent on recognition from others. They survived colonialism, war, and systematic discrimination. They are still here. The persistence itself became an act of resistance. When indigenous veterans were barred from Legion halls where other soldiers gathered to share memories and find community, they created their own gatherings. When they were prohibited from laying wreaths at cenotaphs on Remembrance Day, they held their own ceremonies on their own land. When the government denied them benefits through bureaucratic gatekeeping by Indian agents, they fought for decades through legal channels and public advocacy until some justice arrived, always too late, always incomplete. Some indigenous veterans used their military service as a platform for broader activism. They understood that their combat records gave them moral authority that could not be easily dismissed. They had proven their loyalty and courage in the most extreme circumstances possible. When they spoke about injustice, they spoke with the credibility of those who had sacrificed everything for their nations. Slowly, painfully, their voices began to be heard. The formal acknowledgments came generations late. In 2025, the Canadian Armed Forces finally delivered a formal apology for systemic racism and discrimination against Indigenous service members. Monuments were erected. National Indigenous Veterans Day was established. Academic researchers documented the full scope of what had been done and what had been denied. But by the time these recognitions arrived, most of the veterans who deserved them were already gone. This is the fundamental tragedy. Justice delayed is justice denied takes on visceral meaning when you understand that Indigenous veterans waited 50, 60, 70 years for recognition that should have been immediate. They grew old waiting. They died waiting. Their children and grandchildren received apologies on their behalf, meaningful but incomplete, powerful but painful reminders of what could have been if honor had been given when it was earned. The lesson for future generations is clear and uncompromising. Honor cannot wait. Recognition cannot be postponed until it becomes convenient or politically safe. Warriors who sacrifice deserve immediate acknowledgement, not belated gestures delivered to their graves. Every year of delay is another betrayal, another message that their service mattered less than others, another wound that never heals. The contrast between Eisenhower and Crerar remains instructive precisely because it shows that choices were possible. Discrimination was not inevitable. Leaders could have chosen differently. Crerar proved that treating all soldiers with equal dignity was achievable even in 1945. The fact that others did not make the same choice reveals moral failure, not historical inevitability. Today, as the last Indigenous veterans of World War II pass into history, we face a choice about memory. Will we continue telling comfortable narratives about the greatest generation saving the world, or will we tell the complete truth that includes both heroism and betrayal? Will we honor Indigenous warriors with words alone, or will we address the ongoing injustices their descendants face? Will we learn from this history or will we repeat it in new forms? The warriors deserve complete truth. They deserve recognition of their courage and acknowledgement of their betrayal. They deserve to be remembered not as footnotes but as central figures in the story of defeating fascism. They deserve to have their example inspire future generations to serve with honor while demanding that their service be honored in return. This is the debt we owe. This is the story we must tell. This is how we finally, belatedly, imperfectly, give them what they earned but never received. The full respect and recognition they deserve from the moment they first put on the uniform and crossed oceans to fight for freedom that was denied them at home.